Hello, everyone. We are going to wait a couple more minutes before we get started here today. All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the panel discussion, Upping the Ante with the Device Intelligence, Managing Self-Excluded Players. My name is Christy Wright and I will be the moderator on today's call. Now, just a few housekeeping items today. First, the webinar is being recorded and we will send out the recording shortly after this call. Also, this presentation is interactive, so please submit any questions that you may have throughout the call in the chat box. Now, before I introduce the panel today, I'm going to go through what topics are going to be discussed today. First, the panel is going to discuss current trends they are seeing in the gambling environment and how to best manage self-exclusion at key integration points of the player's journey. Then the panel will share their recommendations on how to protect your good customers while keeping bad guys out by leveraging device intelligence. And lastly, we will learn from the panelists' experiences on the best solutions to identify good consumers and authenticate players. Our panelists today include Compliance Manager David Webb from Bet Construct, Head of Partnerships, Gavin Barker from TransUnion, formerly iOvation, and Head of Gaming, Adam Doyle from TruNarrative. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thanks.
So we're going to start with the first discussion topic. What are the trends you are currently seeing in the gambling fraud environment? And Gavin, I'll have you start this one out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christy. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be able to connect with you all virtually. So, yeah, really good to speak with you. So I think when we look at this, iGaming and the gambling industry has been established for a very long time, and it's been one of the kind of verticals I would say that's been at the forefront of kind of digital adoption. What's come with that is for a number of years now, there's been a number of different types of fraud that the industry has faced, and there's a number of those that we'll all know about. I think what's really changed is not so much the types of fraud themselves, but around more the sophistication of how the fraud is actually being carried out. And I think that's fueled by a number of things such as technical advances, the open availability of devices, people becoming more savvy around processes, and then obviously what we've also had over the last few years is that whole kind of increase in data breaches, which is essentially leaked out, compromised credentials and personal information, out into the marketplace, which is then utilized by individuals to, bypass certain traditional ID proofing technologies. So I think that's been a big change. And some of the things that we've seen over the last few years is increases in, certain fraud types. So things like bonus abuse, so where those individuals are signing up multiple times to abuse the welcome bonus, is definitely something that's continued to increase, and I think is something that'll be around for some time. We've seen increases in payment fraud, so again, utilising things like stolen and compromised cards to make deposits has always been an issue, and it's started to increase again. One of the big ones that we've seen increase as well over the last, I'd say, 2 to 3 years has been around account takeover, and that is, essentially where the fraudsters are looking to get into a good account to misuse it, to either siphon the funds or maliciously spend the funds in some capacity. And that's been something that's really, really increased. And I think that's mainly driven by what we've seen as a spike in credential stuffing attacks or brute force attacks. One of the key areas that we have seen spike, though, I'd say especially over the last 3 years or more, especially as there's become more and more of a focus on it, given the regulatory landscape and how that's evolved, is really around the whole kind of responsible gaming aspect and looking at problem gamblers and identifying this early. Now, obviously, it's key to point out that things like problem gambling or self-exclusion, as we refer to it, is not typically classed as fraud like the others, but it is definitely an area of risk to operators and platform providers alike, and it's an area that has massively increased. You'll see some of the stats on the screen here, and there's some pretty big numbers on there. Before I talk to them specifically, to give you an idea of how iAversion's self-exclusion proposition works as such, is that where an iGaming operator is utilising iAversion's services, we're embedded within their digital property. What that means is that when an individual comes to interact, we're able to profile a device for a number of different elements of risk. If an operator is then at some point informed of self-exclusion, the key fact here is that the operator can actually place a flag of evidence against the account for that self-excluded player. That instantly propagates to the devices that are connected to that player's account, which means that if that player then comes back to them or any one of their brands or any other operator, the flag of evidence exists against the device to say it's linked to self-exclusion evidence, and that can be used then to trigger your responsible gaming processes, enhanced due diligence, and other aspects that you might look at. So it's a very important flag against the device, and it's key to point out as well that it's linked to the device, because what that means is that if the individual comes back, and we all know one of the things that we'll typically do is manipulate elements of their personal data, vary the name a little bit, change the email address a little bit. Because we're looking at the device and the flag is against the device as well, it means that even if they are manipulating this personal data, we will still flag the device as a risk indicator. As you can see here, there's been some pretty big numbers. So 363,000 flags of evidence within our network were placed in 2019. That's a huge increase, 63% over the year before. It's growing year on year, and I think, as we said before, a lot more focus is put on this now. So there's a lot more operators out there identifying this early and placing those flags of evidence. It then propagates to actually 3 million devices within our network have got an instance of self-exclusion evidence flagged either directly or indirectly to them, and that links directly into just over 1 million actual end consumer accounts. So these are big numbers and big spikes and increases over the years. And again, I think something that will continue to increase, especially as processes get rolled out into different regions and we all starting to adopt it globally. Self-exclusion as a risk is going to be something that's going to continue to increase.
Great, thank you, Gavin. Adam, what's your take on the current trends you're seeing?
Yeah, completely agree with the points that Gavin covered there. I think as technology's involved, it's becoming a lot more challenging for the operators. And as Gavin mentioned, I think having and understanding the fingerprints of a device itself, it's so key. It can help you see the location that the person's coming from when they might be suggesting they're coming from elsewhere. And typically, whether it's people who are trying to get around self-exclusion, problem gamblers, they're normally using some elements that we can see there. So we can see that maybe the same date of birth or same surname or the same mobile number have been connected. So I think that's very, very important. I think what we see as well now is players are a lot more savvier. They understand ways around sort of regulation, the rules, and David can probably cover that in a bit more detail in a bit. But what I'm also seeing and hearing a lot more about, it's around sort of proxy betting or private members groups. And these are sort of multiple accounting and sort of prepaid card schemes. So these are actually companies that are going to normal people and trying to benefit from their bonuses and getting them to play their money, and they sort of will be guaranteed £100. Gavin and David, I'm not sure if you sort of came across these before, and you know, sort of how you sort of seen the ways that you sort of protected against this, if there is anything.
Yeah, I think certainly from my aspect, I totally agree. I think people are more savvy these days around not just technology, but also around, you know, understanding processes and what they need to do to manipulate those processes. And that's given rise to, you know, a few varying things. You know, the other aspect that we've seen happening quite a bit recently, and I've seen, you know, a number of sites around this on the dark web, is around, you know, essentially what I would class as mule accounts, where individuals will create an account for an individual and then you know, pass on the login credentials to them so they can either play games and bet in regions where they're not, you know, they shouldn't be allowed to gamble. They use it for funneling and money laundering. So I think there's definitely been some increases on that. And again, looking at using a combination of services, there's ways you can identify this, as you quite rightly said. There's services that you would use for regulatory reasons, your ID and V and KYC things that can help. And then obviously layering device in there becomes quite interesting as well, because being able to understand what is the true location. You know, is the device trying to pretend it's something that it's not? Has it got a history of past bad reputation? These are all things that can enhance risk mitigation for iGaming operators. But I agree with you. I think the sophistication around the types of frauds has really, really bloomed in the last 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, with our experience as both an operator, a B2C operator, and also a B2B provider, we've encountered lots of very sophisticated frauds involving teams using stolen IDs and stolen documents or copies of documents. They use the data to open the account, and of course, most operators have an automated ID verification service, so that data will be passed as genuine. And the teams know that there's, you know, every operator works to a certain threshold. We all have a different risk appetite, which means we'll open those accounts based on that data that we're getting, assuming it's verified by our ID verification services. So we don't request documentation initially. We will further down the line as they hit thresholds, but you have that certain risk element that's involved first of all. So we're getting lots of, you know, we've seen lots of different teams that will do this sort of thing. So in that aspect, having device checking and a strong document verification service will obviously mitigate those risks for the companies. Moving on to the self-exclusion points. Whilst the majority of players out there, self-excluded players, are genuine, there are a number of fraudulent accounts that deliberately use self-exclusion to test an operator's systems in terms of actually preventing that person from gambling again, which is why you get the various different people that will keep they know that there's, you know, a certain checking thresholds that you employ, so they'll change and vary names and do all sorts of different things to try and open duplicate accounts to place bets while self-excluded, which they know that they can then come back if they lose a lot of money and request that those bets get refunded and those deposits get refunded. So you know, certainly from our instances of the level of fraud and sophistication that's out there, things like device checking, I think, are a very good tool for us to go into battle against these people.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Now we're going to actually ask the question for you, the audience. So I'll launch a poll here. So what are your biggest fraud and or risk concerns as an operator? And you can check all that apply. Yeah, it looks like managing self-exclusion players and bonus abuse are definitely high up there, along with identity theft. So thank you all for participating. All right, so we're going to continue on to the next topic here with our panel. How do you best manage self-exclusion with a single customer view, and what are the key integration points? And Gavin, I'll have you take this one away.
Yeah, no problem. So I think, again, when it comes to managing self-exclusion, there's no quick fix or simple solution that is going to, deliver that in one go. It's about, leveraging a number of different complementary services that can help you identify problem gambling early on, and then also mitigate problem gamblers once they're identified, returning back into your infrastructure. It's easier said than done, because as we said before, people are savvy, people will manipulate aspects of information to try and bypass. But again, it's about having a very robust, holistic service in place. I mean, when it comes to the kind of key touch points, I know personally from my experience working with a number of operators in my capacity in a direct sales role here at Ivation, it was always very important to actually identify where the key access points are, where are the risk points in that customer journey, where an individual could potentially get into the account to do something, or they could actually even obviously create the account in the first instance. So it's very important to identify within your digital journey, what are the risk points, which points are you exposed, and then once you identify those touch points, it's then about putting in place the right types of solutions that will only add friction when it's actually needed. You don't want to put things in that are going to impede or impact good customers or the user experience, because that's so pivotal in this industry. But it's about having the ones that will kick in and apply the right friction at the point in time that it's needed. Now, when I was working with a lot of operators, the two kind of key touch points that really stood out as high risk were, number one, registration. At that point where you're first taking on board that new customer, that is obviously a high risk point. So looking at things like the device to see the velocity of how many times it's attempted to sign up. Is it a device associated to fraud? Is it a device that you've seen before that's actually got self-exclusion evidence against it from you and or another operator? Identifying that at the very front door and then not allowing a high-risk account to be created is obviously incredibly valuable. So that was always a very key touch point, looking at the front door and trying to stop that account from being created. Outside of that, looking through the actual workflow, typically what we saw from that then is that when it comes to actually other touch points of access, to actually place a bet or play a game or deposit, by and large, you typically had to log into the account. So that meant that logging became a very highly discussed integration point, and that's where we have a number of customers that utilize the service today, because that's where somebody can get into accounts. So potentially where an account has been created that might have bypassed the processes you had up front, or even potentially the account was created and it looked good at the time, but something's changed over time and there's now evidence associated with that device. Actually looking at the device when it's logging into the account can also be incredibly valuable. From a self-exclusion angle, you can obviously see straight away if the device has got self-exclusion placed against it by you and or another operator, and then leverage that to kick off different workflows in accordance with your own internal processes. But again, looking at the risk of things like the velocity and where is it coming from as well, also provide really valuable contextual data that you can use in a risk kind of strategy. I know when we talk about these different touch points and how you can kind of have this holistic approach to self-exclusion, it's often a little trickier than said, because operators will have multiple brands, they may have different departments, and they're not always on the same infrastructure, so that can prove quite challenging. The value with the device aspect is that you can leverage the intelligence across the channel, but it's also another pivotal point in which Adam can probably talk a little bit more to, is how TruNarrative can assist, because they can simplify this into one manageable API with multiple integration points. So it allows you to condense the amount of dev work and resources that are required as an operator. But I think overall it's a combination of understanding the right services to use at the right times, and then also looking at your workflow and saying, where is our risk coming from? Where are the high risk interaction points where something could happen, and then applying those services to that. That's my kind of thoughts on how I would approach the problem. Adam, I don't know if you've got some views on that.
Yeah, no, and you're exactly right. You know, typically these people are using some same in the form identity, so devices is very key. But also using, whether it's pulling in self-exclusion list that you guys have, but also operators, you have your own self-exclusion list, you have the GAM stop. It's putting in velocity checks of have we seen these people before. And you know, with fraudsters, it doesn't matter if you've got multiple jurisdictions and multiple brands, or the same with people who are self-excluded themselves. They might not realize that you have these multiple brands. So allowing you to pull everything via a single platform and have that, as we call it, sort of the single view, it's really, really key, because it allows you to protect yourself as your business. And if you have other sort of other brands or other subsidiaries, it allows you to share that information across everyone. And having the single platform as well, that gives you the flexibility. So whether it's sort of making changes as and when you're seeing sort of risk appearing or happening to you, you can do this in minutes rather than it taking you days or weeks with having to go to multiple suppliers, having to speak to your technical team. So I think it's a mixture of a number of things: using self-exclusion lists, using your own data, being able to put velocity in there as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, and sorry, Gavin. Yes, just to add my little bit in as well, from an operator's point of view, obviously there's very different types of operators out there. Bet Construct is a good example, predominantly B2B, but we do have a B2C service, and that B2C service is an online website which has white label partners underneath it, so therefore various different brands. Customers in the UK are allowed to open accounts with those various different brands, but if they self-exclude with one of those brands, then they must self-exclude with all of those brands under that license. So for us, it's very important to have a solution or solutions in place that allow us to detect and link those accounts across, which is why, again, I totally agree with Gavin's points about the touch points for clients. Registration is obviously the main one. You want to be able to detect someone that's already self-excluded, certainly at registration point, and block them at that point, and obviously link their self-exclusion to that account so that it's the self-exclusion is exactly the same. And of course, it might be someone that's self-excluded on one brand and has previously registered in the past on another brand. So it's important for you to have that, again, that check when they log in to their old account. So again, that you can marry up those two accounts to that one individual customer. And as Adam says, it's very important to have a single player view of everything that's going on when you're in certain arrangements like this. Also, you do need some degree of flexibility as an operator in what you actually want to do with it, because as you grow your business, depending on what your matching criteria is, the number of false positives are going to increase the more players that you take on. So it's important to have not only these solutions that provide you with the alerts and the flagging of accounts. It's important to have a robust process behind that in terms of actually reviewing the data, just so that you can rule out the false positives for people that are genuinely trying to open up accounts and aren't self-excluded, but their data details are quite similar to other people that are self-excluded. And you know, I've certainly seen a lot of occasions where more than you would believe, where people have got same surname, same date of birth. It's incredible, but it does exist.
Great, thank you. Now, the next question for the panel is, how do you protect your good customers or consumers while keeping the bad guys out?
Yeah, and this is, you know, incredibly important across, you know, pretty much every vertical out there. You know, any business wants to be able to accept good customers, interact with good customers, and, you know, keep out the bad guys. In the iGaming kind of space, obviously this is a key thing as well, because it's such a highly competitive landscape. Things like user experience are, you know, things that really help a brand do well and establish themselves in the market. So it's an interesting kind of balancing act about having the right processes and the right services in place that will allow you enough you know, space as such to allow the good customers in and not put too much burden or friction on them. Because if you put a process in place that's painful for them to go through, either at registration or login or any other touch point, you know, you do see abandonment rates increase. You know, they'll jump to another brand. You know, people are not as brand loyal as you know they used to be. Consumers are more fickle these days. So again, you know, you apply friction, they'll go somewhere else. So in this aspect, it's about looking at, you know, the services and where you position them in your waterfall or your workflow of checks, so that the friction is only stepping up or being implied when it's really needed. The vast majority of transactions, and I mean, even looking at throughout our own networks, when we look at the kind of iGaming space, you know, the high volumes, the, you know, up to, I'd say, mid 90% of transactions, they're good transactions coming from genuine consumers going about their normal, you know, business. So you don't want to be kind of you know, putting burden there. So it's about identifying the small minority of bad actors within that huge stack of good interactions. And again, you know, device has a very interesting play in that, because fundamentally all these consumers will be using some form of device to interact, because of the fact that, you know, the iGaming space is all digital pretty much, apart from some of the retail stuff. But vast majority, the consumers using a device. It could be a smartphone, it could be a PlayStation, a laptop. You know, not only can we cover any type of device that's able to profile the web or essentially run an app, the fact is that the JavaScripts in the SDK that actually do the device fingerprinting, that collate the device data, they're invisible to the consumer. So they sit in the background, in the back end. Obviously, you will have T's and C's within your policies, you know, outlining that you're utilizing fraud prevention services. But to the consumer, it's completely invisible. So if I go to a site that's protected by iOvation, as I go through that sign-up process or even that login process, you know, the check that's done on my device is invisible in the background. So there's no burden or negativity put onto the consumer interaction or the consumer journey, which is incredibly important. And it also means that because you're able to control when and where you step up, you have access within iOvation to your own user interface, where you can create your own rules. So as David mentioned before about operators having different risk appetites, what that allows them to do is create different types of rules in the system, either by region or by product or by game. It's totally optional to them, so that you're only looking at and identifying for the actual risk, the risky indicators. So the vast majority of good customers will flow through that, and then what you're going to do is weed out the small amounts. So you're going to start applying friction only to those ones where they've triggered something that you've deemed as a business is high risk. Things like, for instance, the same device potentially signing up, you know, 5 times in under a second. You know, that's a high risk. You'd call that out. You have that flexibility to create rules on the fly and put them live. Again, so that you can manage this process. If you see rules that are triggering and they are potentially having, you know, false positives, I think David mentioned before, or it's applying too much friction to good customers, you can actually amend that rule and tweak it and adjust it on the fly. So you're actually in control and able to essentially, you know, change your workflow as and whenever you need to. So it's an interesting one. I mean, again, you know, it's all important about getting good customers in the front door, and I think a large part of that really comes from only applying friction when it's necessary. That's just my thoughts. I don't know, Adam, David, if you thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's one of those. I think it's probably the biggest topic that we sit down and talk to operators when we start working with them. Obviously, TruNarrative and Innovation, we work with Bet Constructor, and I know Gavin and myself and the team, when we sat down and started talking with David and his team, is very much of trying to put these checks in to make sure that we're protecting the good players, but keeping the bad people out. If you look at it with certain operators with the size of the business, 1% can equal hundreds of thousands of pounds to them. So making sure that the sort of not getting rid of the good customers, it's key to the growth of the business. So it's really around carrying out a number of automated and invisible checks as early on in the player journey. I think that's key. We currently have 50 plus third-party suppliers that are helping with a number of these things. So the data is out there, and I think I'll probably say it a few times, gone are the days where it was about using as few data points and as cheap as possible. I think that's really gone. I think as well, supporting this with sort of velocity checks, the self-exclusion list that Gavin's talked about, the self-exclusion list that operators have, and with other things like GamStop, using sort of their own data, whether it's blacklists, whitelists. I think it's really trying to bring together all this information, and by doing this, what you can do is you can offer a customer journey that's invisible to the good customers and only really visible to the bad people, or maybe the people that you're not sure about and you want to have those further conversations with. By putting these certain triggers in throughout the journey, I think that's the key way to do it, to make sure that you're not turning away the genuine people.
Agreed. I think a large part of it is again, it's about mapping out what your waterfall of checks are going to be, and when you're going to, and only applying additional ones in certain strategies, so that the friction's ramping up, but only in certain cases. David, with your experience, is that something that you've seen? Have you got any thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, obviously as a compliance manager, I'm naturally risk averse. So from my aspect, there can't be too many checks. But certainly, I mean, I've been in the industry for many years now, and I can remember back, to touch on a point that Adam made there, going back a few years ago, registration forms for online operators were very, very simple, and the data was kept to a minimum. And it was almost like, the registration point was the point to make it nice and easy for a customer to come on board onto your website and gamble. But as we've moved into a much more regulated environment, as Adam pointed out, those days are well and truly gone. But I think certainly from a UK perspective, I've always said the market in the UK is incredibly mature. People, if they've got one gambling account, the chances are they've got several gambling accounts. So they're used to filling out all this data for for the requirements on a regular basis now. So I don't believe that is the sort of friction point that it used to be. What is important is for those automated and invisible checks that we do for ID and date of birth and address purposes, and to make that part as frictionless as possible, because I think people now expect that the majority of them will be verified without the need to send through documents immediately. At some point during that relationship with the customer, yes, of course, we've all got our own thresholds, and you will be, we will require all customers to back up that ID with their documentary evidence. But it's as Gavin said, it's getting that balance right at the registration point to make sure that user journey is as frictionless as possible for the good customers, for those that have got solid data out there, and there's no issues. At the same time, I think you have to balance it so that you've got checks in the right place, so that you can put as many barriers up to the bad players as you possibly can. And again, that is down to the operator's risk appetite, as we've said. It's down to some of the jurisdictions they're operating in, and various different things. So to have a platform, for instance, like TruNarrative, where you can set these journeys up with the different providers, and and as Gavin said, adjust those. I mean, we, you know, in the UK we do an annual anti-money laundering risk assessment, so you have to obviously change things as your business changes. Your business might have grown. If you're a white label operator, you might have added more partners. So to have that degree of flexibility within the system to change it as your risk appetites change, then that's a fantastic advantage.
And I think that's the key thing that you mentioned there, Dave. It's about waterfall in it. So, you know, you might not need to use all these checks, but by putting it in, so if it's not doing it, it is a seamless customer journey, because behind the scenes it's flowing through the different checks. You know, if you're matching on that person, you know, no one's any the wiser. But I think that's really a key thing by putting sort of the in there. And again, that can change depending on different jurisdictions. For the UK, you might be tied to them what you're in, sort of Malta or Gibraltar, etc. So I think having those flexibility, I think that's key as well.
Absolutely.
Definitely. I think, you know, a couple of things that you mentioned there, Dave, I think, you know, are completely spot on. You know, consumers these days, when they are signing up for something, you know, they anticipate that they're going to have to fill in probably more than what they did, you know, 10, 15 years ago or more, because, you know, they're just used to that now, and they're also more aware these days themselves around you know, application processes and fraud and things like that, so they kind of anticipate and expect to see a bit more. So it's sometimes not as much as a burden as you might think to the consumer. And the other thing as well is we talked about technology and how technology has really driven a lot of change across industries, and especially in the iGaming space, around how you interact with your customers and what that, you know, how the app looks and feels and all that kind of good stuff. We talked about the fact that, you know, fraudsters are able to, you know, utilize technology to their advantage, but this is also an advantage for operators as well. There is services that are now available that give you rich sources of intelligence like device that are invisible. So there is services and there is data out there that can be leveraged.
Great, thank you so much. Now, the next question is just for Adam and Gavin. As you two are protecting the good customers, what impact has your business and others seen leveraging device intelligence? And Adam, I'll let you start this one out.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's using a mixture. It's obviously using the things that we can see via the iovation piece with the devices, looking at which countries people are coming from. You might have building your own different risk rules there. It might be times of the day that people are playing. So I think using these sort of devices is very key. Mixing that in with mobile data as well. Have you seen this information before? Has this mobile number been used X amount of times? That's just allowing you to sort of paint that better picture of the player. This can change significantly with different operators. We really see that some are a bit more risk appetite than others. So it's really trying to understand the point when you want to consume stuff. It might be when certain people are depositing. It might be have people been changing the payments details. So I think Gavin's probably the best person who can cover this. I think it's doing certain checks on certain triggers, whether it's registration, whether it's deposits, whether it's payments methods, whether it's changing payments methods, whether it's updating mobiles. That's where we're really seeing people trying to leverage the device intelligence.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, a lot of the experience I had with selling the solution into kind of the iGaming space, the value that the operators saw, typically, I would say there's always consistence, but then some would vary dependent on, what the particular challenge or issue that operator had that we were trying to fix. They typically kind of fell into kind of two categories, I would say. So the first side was around the fraud and risk angle, and that was, by utilizing device, they were able to identify patterns of behavior, indicators of risk, and the reputation of the device, and leverage that to reduce fraud losses. Whether those fraud losses were reduced from identifying things like bonus abuse, payment fraud, or even affiliate fraud, as we've had a number of operators that use us within their affiliate channels to spot that. Really help them to reduce those fraud losses. Some of the other benefits that come in with that is because the device intelligence can automate decisioning, as you can via the TruNarrative platform. You can also see some operational benefits, so that the teams that typically carry out investigations, you can actually reduce the workload of those, because if you know they're already high risk or bad, you can simply auto kick them out and save some of the manual reviewers' times and what they're looking at. And then some of the other aspects were more towards kind of the positive angles. So the fraud and risk piece was always there, was always consistent. And we've got a number of case studies from various operators talking about the value we've brought there. But a lot of the benefit as well has also been around accelerating good customers. The fact that this is minimal friction and doesn't impact them means that they can actually get to do what they want to do potentially quicker and easier. You can use the data that we return almost as data enrichment to actually start to understand your customer base, the devices they use, when do they typically log in, all kinds of information like that, to actually start building up a trust in the actual data that you're seeing. And you could utilize that to either streamline their processes, offer them better bonuses potentially if that was something you were looking to do, and essentially just allow those good ones to keep doing what they're doing, and potentially even enhance user experience and add a security around account takeover as well.
I was going to say, Gavin, you're probably seeing where you're saying around sort of times and when people are coming on. People can use that for behavioural as well, can't they? To see, is this person? It's a good indication for account takeover. If I'm normally playing at a certain time, and then all of a sudden I'm playing every hour or late into the night, where it is for me, that's another good indication for the operator.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, logging and kind of that account takeover, and also kind of understanding your customer base is incredibly valuable. As you said there, we can do risk indication. We also have tools that can actually allow operators to pair the user's devices specifically to their account, so that if somebody comes to log in and they're using a device that's not actually authorized to access that account, we can flag that to you. You can start building up patterns around things like that. Gavin Barker typically uses his MacBook and his iPhone and something else to log in with. They're typically always in the UK, and then suddenly get an interaction coming from a device that's potentially coming out of somewhere like Russia or somewhere else. You can have that as a trigger to potentially stop that access, because that's not the norm for that player. Why is that happening? If the device is in one country and then a minute later it's in a completely different one. So leveraging a lot of the data we return as data enrichment is also incredibly valuable to a number of businesses. And I know a lot of the operators that utilize our services today, they do take a lot of the data from us and they utilize it internally for a number of other different things as well.
Great. Thank you. Now, before we go to our last topic with our panel, we're going to ask the audience one last poll question here. So how important is user experience to your success as an operator, and do you have authentication services to help in this area? Is it very important? And yes, you do have authentication services already in place. Very important, but no authentication service in place as of yet, or no, not important, and you don't want or need authentication services. All right. Share results here. So yeah, it looks like everyone agrees 100%, agree that it's extremely important, and majority of you all have authentication services in place. So that is fantastic. Let me go back here. And this does lead us to the last question or final discussion topic for the panel. From your experiences, what are the best processes to identify or verify good players? And David, let's start with you.
Yeah, in terms of the solutions out there, or myself as compliance manager at Bet Construct have looked into a few different partners over the last couple of years, to certainly the last 24 months. I don't think there's a silver bullet out there, but I think when you're an operator, it's important for you to understand what data sources ID verification partners are using, so that you can make an informed decision on your selection with those particular ID verification partners. Going back to these various different partners will have all sorts of different pass rates, and going back to the waterfall process that we've spoken about on several occasions throughout this. It's always very important for an operator to get a good pass rate in terms of their invisible ID checks, if you like. So if you utilize 2 or 3 of these solutions before you go on to ID or to document verification, you'll find that you'll get a much better pass rate, because these different ID verification partners, they will use different data solutions as well, or data sources, should I say. That will also give you more confidence regarding the accuracy of the verification as well that you've had. So I think that's very important. And in terms of us, BetConstruct in particular, as a B2B operator, we have to remain flexible with regards to using some ID verification partners, because our B2B partners might have differing opinions about which solutions to use. They will have gone out and done the same process as me and spoken to everyone, and obviously taking different points from the various different presentations or pitches that they sat down in front of. There might be cost implications as well. So it's very important for us to have that degree of flexibility when we work with different partners. That could possibly lead to many integrations on the platform, or we could go to someone like TruNarrative and partner with them, because obviously that saves us on several integrations. Instead of doing several, we just do the one, which is one of the reasons why we decided to partner up with them. That's all right. I'll grab the pint when the lockdown's over. And of course, the other thing as well is we also work internationally, and some solutions will work better in different jurisdictions than others, purely and simply because of their accessibility to the data in those different jurisdictions. So again, that's important for us, both for ourselves as an international B2C operator. We operate in several different countries across the world, and we're looking for verification services throughout all of those countries. And obviously some of our partners operate in various different jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point, is the fact that there isn't a silver bullet. There's not one singular product that is going to take away all your burdens and pains in one go, or even the flip reverse, that's going to give you all the positives that you need. Again, it's that kind of combination of complementary services and how you put them together in a waterfall as such to really get the best value out of that. And I think quite rightly, as David said there as well, the typical challenge is that you're going to have to potentially look at multiple vendors, which means multiple APIs, which can be tricky to manage. It means multiple vendor contracts all expiring at different times, and try to manage that aspect. And then you've also got the aspect that if you are operating in multiple regions, you're forced to use more vendors because of the data constraints in certain regions. That all becomes very, very difficult to manage from an operator perspective, especially if you've got multiple jurisdictions, multiple brands, especially in the BetConstruct side of things as well. And again, I think that's why it's really kind of interesting to look at the architecture and what you can do with technology to make this easier for you. And I think again, that's where TruNarrative and Adam and the team can really offer some serious value, is by having that singular API that's already got those components built into it, meaning that you don't have to have the dev work. You've got one API and one contract for all of the services. Actually really can help you streamline the process hugely. I don't know if I'm sure you will agree with me on that one, Adam.
Yeah,
I think the round's getting bigger, Adam.
Yeah, I know it's costing me this. Everything that you guys said there, I completely agree. And this is definitely, why John created TruNarrative all these years ago. We definitely identified that, using one supplier or using one element of data sources, it's not the way anymore. It's using a waterfall process, and with the sort of the changes in regulation, the cost of acquisition is really increasing. It's important to use as much data as possible, which is sort of frictionless to the players. So this gives them a seamless customer journey. It means that, probably not the best word, but it makes them stickier, it makes them more loyal. And also by using all this data as well, it gives the operator sort of a clearer and fuller picture of the player, which can mean by doing this at the front, it can reduce the amount of things that you may be having to ask them to do later on in the process. So, using a waterfall process, orchestrating the flow of using multiple suppliers, whether it's different brands or whether it's different jurisdictional regulations, using it there, and using sort of risk scores, so pulling that together about what your risk appetite is, using device checking, having a look at name and address information, pulling together any of your sort of black list, your white list, your red list, using the PEP and sanctions mobiles. If you can do it all via a single API, the great things that you're having is you're not having the potential issues of using the multiple APIs that might not talk in the same language, so you might have a delay or a silo effect. We all know with operators, the biggest challenge is technical resource. People can be fighting for projects internally, so it's trying to get stuff done there. Once stuff's implemented, there might be a new supplier like you see, so you've got to go back in the queue, which can take weeks, months, and years. So that's where we really see our benefit coming from there. That, as I mentioned, we have over 50 suppliers in there. You can use our technology, you can use all the different suppliers out there, like to Iovation. You can pull together the information and the risk-based modules that you might have an operator, and this just gives you a clear indication. Makes you more comfortable, and again, it allows you, when you get audited, it allows you to demonstrate to the regulator that you're trying to go above and beyond how you are managing your players.
And I think amongst that, one of the important points that you mentioned there was the cost of acquisition. Acquisition costs have gone up and up and up for operators over the last 10 years or so, predominantly down to the competitiveness of marketing. But I think within the last two to 3 years as well, with the increased regulation or regulatory requirements around operators to be able to gain as much information on that, on your players as possible before that, you open their accounts for deposit, etc. So those costs have definitely increased, and anything that can help with those costs, and going back to the top of the show when we talked about fraudulent players, the device recognition certainly is a good weapon to reduce your costs in terms of fraud, etc. So overall, having a robust journey at registration, login, etc., throughout the course of a client's account for all the different regulatory checks that you need, and also having a solution that provides you with some degree of safety against fraudulent accounts will obviously pay its way in the long run.
Yeah, and I think the other things that you're probably seeing, you mentioned there with additional competitors in the market, with the cost of acquisition going up, you're probably seeing that the lifetime value of the customer might be reducing slightly. So by sort of being able to automate that extra couple of % here, there, and everywhere, it's something which is allowing you to get the reduce the cost of acquisition, and it's also reducing the manual work at the back end for your business there.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Fantastic. Thank you all. I know that we are over time, so I want to be conscious of everyone's time here, and there are some questions that have come in. So what we're going to do, I'm going to include the answers to all of your questions with the recording. So I will reach out to the panel to get those answers for you all. And I just want to thank you all for attending, and I want to thank the 3 panelists that we have today for your participation, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye-bye.